Montana Territory, August 1877, the day the wagon rolled into the dry-boned town of Heart Butte. Folks hardly noticed the woman sitting behind the reins, tall as a man, back stiff as a fence post, face half hidden under the wide brim of her worn hat. But one man did. He saw her before she even stopped the team, standing on the porch of the feed store, his eyes tracking the sway of her movements like they meant something. Her name was Winnie Mae Morton. She stepped down from the wagon with her shoulders hunched, trying to make herself smaller, which was near impossible at 6 feet and a half. Dust clung to her skirt, and her boots were cracked from the journey. She kept her face turned from the few men lounging outside the saloon, who whispered and chuckled like they always did. Winnie was too tall, and the folks she had known back in Wyoming had not been shy about saying she was too plain, too quiet, too much. She had learned to keep her head down, to disappear where she could. But she had 2 little girls to feed, twins, 5 years old, and she needed work, not kindness. They were asleep in the back of the wagon, curled up in the corner under a wool blanket despite the heat. Frankie and Flora. Abandoned by their father the morning after their 5th birthday. He had left nothing but a note and a hole in the floor where the coin box used to be. She opened the wagon bed carefully, brushing a hand over each girl's forehead. "Stay close, but stay quiet," she whispered. "I won't be long." From the other side of the street, the cowboy still watched. He was lean, sun-browned, maybe 30. A rifle hung from his saddle, and his shirt was rolled to the elbows, showing arms marked by work. His name was Mason Wilder, and he had been riding fence lines for the Double T for nearly 9 years. He was not the kind to stare at women, not the kind to talk just to talk. But something about her moved him. The way she moved like she was trying not to be seen. The way she walked tall even when she tried to shrink. She went into the mercantile. He crossed the street behind her. By the time she came out with a sack of flour in one arm and dried beans in the other, he was waiting by her wagon. "Afternoon," he said. She startled, nearly dropped the sack. "I do not need help. Did not say you did." He tipped his hat, but not like he was trying to charm her, just polite. "Saw you pull in. You new to Heart Butte. I do not plan to stay." "That's so," she nodded, moving to lift the sacks into the wagon bed. He stepped in before she could, taking the heavier one from her. "I said I do not know," he interrupted gently, "but I got 2 hands and a strong back. No harm in using them some." She stared at him like he was speaking words she had not heard in years, kind ones. "You got family out this way?" he asked, glancing toward the girls who were now sitting up, sleepy-eyed and watching him. "No." She hesitated, then added, "Just us." He nodded once. "You looking for work?" when he hesitated. "If there is work that pays in coin or food, I will do it. My neighbor passed last spring. Her place is still standing, but no one's worked those fields since. I help out when I can. Could use someone steady." She looked at him, wary. "Why would you offer that to a stranger?" Mason shrugged. "Just seems like you could use a hand, and you look like the type who would not ask." The next morning, she brought Frankie and Flora to the little house past the creek where Mason lived alone. It was not much, 2 rooms, a lean-to barn, and a patch of ground that had gone to weed, but it was solid. He showed her the fields first, then the chicken coop, then the well. "I will work the fields," she said, "and I can cook." "You do not have to do everything in a day," he told her. "I know how to work." He believed her. By the end of the week, she had turned the earth over behind the house, patched 2 fence rails, and fixed the broken hinge on the barn door. The girls followed her like shadows, quiet and wide-eyed. Mason never asked questions he did not need answers to. He just made space. At night, she cooked over the stove in the cabin, and Mason sat with the girls, showing them how to braid twine or tell how old a horse was by its teeth. Winnie would glance over sometimes, her eyes softening without her knowing it. She had not smiled in a long time. But when Frankie drew a stick horse and named it after Mason, Winnie laughed, and Mason thought it was the best sound he had heard in years. One evening, a storm rolled in fast. Winnie was outside, gathering the last of the wash from the line, when lightning cracked and the wind slammed the barn door open. The girls screamed from inside. Mason ran out past her, straight into the house, scooping both children up and carrying them to the back room. When he came back out, Winnie was still standing there, drenched, staring up at the sky like she had forgotten how to move. He reached for her elbow. "Come inside." "I was not afraid." "I know," he said, voice low, "but I was." Their eyes locked. Rain ran down her cheeks, and he could not tell if it was water or something else. She stepped back, shook her head like she was waking from a dream. The next morning she made coffee and biscuits without a word. He did not push her. But a few days later, after the girls had gone to bed, she sat down on the front step beside him. "My husband left," she said. "Left me with nothing." "I figured something like that," he replied. "He said I was too tall, too much. That no man wanted a woman who looked like she could wrestle a steer." Mason turned to face her. He was a fool. She looked away. "I am not pretty," he leaned forward. "You are strong. You are smart. You are kind. I have watched you work yourself to the bone for those girls. I have seen the way you get quiet when someone thanks you, like you do not know what to do with it. And I have seen beauty in every damn step you take." She sucked in a breath. "Why are you saying this?" "Because I want you to know. Because I see you, Winnie." She blinked once, twice. Then she reached out and touched his arm, just lightly. He covered her hand with his. Inside, the girls stirred in their sleep. The night was quiet again, and for the first time in a long time, Winnie did not feel like hiding. The summer tapered into September with its crisp mornings and quieter skies. The cottonwoods along the creek had begun to yellow, and the nights held a hush that made the world feel paused between breaths. The girls had started to follow Mason around the property when they weren't helping Winnie with small chores, Flora carrying nails in her apron like treasure. Frankie asking questions Mason didn't always know how to answer but tried to anyhow. Winnie didn't speak much more than was needed, but that silence had shifted. It wasn't the kind that built walls, it held space. Mason had started to read her rhythm, the way she'd pause before answering, or how she'd stand still a moment after finishing a task, as if letting the work settle in her bones. She didn't look away from him when he spoke now. She didn't flinch when the girls laughed too loud or when the wind slammed a shutter closed. One morning she brought in an armful of wild gooseberries. Mason was oiling the hinges on the shed door. "I thought I'd try preserves," she said. "If there's sugar." "There is. You'll need to boil the jars. I can get water started on the stove." He waited for a nod before heading inside. She followed, laying the berries out on an old flour sack. As she worked, her sleeves rolled back and her hands quick. Mason leaned against the wall near the stove. "You ever live in a place that had trees thick enough to block the sun?" he asked. She glanced at him, then back at the berries. "No, always wide country. Eastern Montana's got pine forests up nearer the mountains," he said. "Cooler summers, heavy snow in winter." Winnie's fingers paused. "You thinking of leaving?" "Not yet, just thinking." He watched her a moment. I don't plan that far ahead, but you could, if you wanted." She dropped a handful of stems in a tin pan. "I used to think about Minnesota. My mother came from near Big Stone Lake." She told stories about the loons and the deep cold. "I thought maybe I'd see it someday." "Nothing stopping you but distance, and money, and time, and 2 children." He smiled faintly. "All fair points." They worked in easy quiet for a while. The water on the stove began to steam. Flora and Frankie were outside feeding the chickens. their voices carrying faintly through the open window. "Frankie wants a dog," Mason said after a while. "She told you?" She asked if I knew where to find one that wouldn't bite. "She's careful." Flora would take the biggest beast she could find and try to ride it. "That tracks." Winnie reached for the jar tongs. "I don't want them to grow up thinking they're missing something." "They're not. They've got you." She hesitated, then spoke low. "I don't know how to be both mother and father." "You don't have to, you just have to be steady, which you are." The jars clinked softly as she filled them. "You ever think about having a family?" He folded his arms. "Used to. My brother did. Had 3 boys before he passed. I helped raise them for a while. You don't talk about him. Not much to say that doesn't sit heavy." "I could listen," she said. He looked at her long, then nodded once. "He drowned crossing the Milk River in spring flood. I was riding behind him, couldn't reach him in time. His horse stumbled and that was it. I'm sorry, thank you." The wind rattled the window pane once, then fell still again. "You're good with the girls," she said after a pause. "They make it easy." "No, they don't," she said, and something in her voice turned warm. "But you try anyway." He watched her as she wiped her hands on her apron. "You trust me enough now to say that?" "I do." Outside, the girls called for them. Probably a hen gone missing or a snake near the fence again. Winnie didn't move right away, neither did he. "You ever want to leave," Mason said quietly, "you just say the word. I'd help you load the wagon, I'd see you safe." She met his gaze. "Why would you do that?" "Because I care what happens to you, and not just because of the girls." Her throat moved, but she didn't speak. He stepped closer, slow. "I like your voice, Winnie. I like how you think before you speak. I like that you don't pretend to be softer than you are. And if I never leave, then I'll still be here." She nodded once. "All right." They joined the girls in the yard, where Flora was holding a fat hen upside down, and Frankie was explaining loudly that feathers didn't mean it could fly. Mason took the bird from Flora before she got scratched, and Winnie laughed under her breath, just once. The sun was high and warm, and the scent of gooseberry lingered on her hands. That night she tucked the girls in, then stepped out to the porch where Mason was mending a harness under the lantern light. "I've been thinking," she said. He set the leather down and looked at her. "If we had a dog, it'd need to be good with children, and not too old." He smiled slow. "I might know a man up near Chodau who breeds shepherd mixes." She sat beside him. "I'd like to write to him." "I'll ride out in the morning, quicker than post." She nodded again. "Thank you." They didn't say anything more. The quiet stretched easy between them. The stars above blinked soft and steady, and the lantern flickered gold across her face. He didn't reach for her hand yet, and she didn't move closer, but the space between them no longer felt like a gap. It felt like something waiting to be filled. The dog arrived by wagon in early October, a young speckled shepherd with pale eyes and a cautious gait. Mason paid the breeder in beans and tanned hides, all traded from the fall gatherings near Sun River. When he lowered the dog from the wagon bed, Frankie held her breath and Flora crouched low, hands outstretched like she was calling in a wild bird. "He's not ready for hugging," Mason said. "Let him find his place first." Winnie stood nearby, arms folded, watching the dog circle the edge of the yard, nose low to the ground. The girls waited, still as stones, and after a long minute the dog padded over and sat between them like he'd chosen them himself. "Name him," Mason said. "Juniper," Flora said at once. Frankie nodded. "He looks like he knows things." Juniper curled at their feet, tail thumping soft against the dirt. Winnie looked at Mason, then not just glanced but held him in her gaze like she was seeing new things in him. He didn't look away. By the next week, frost had come. The mornings were tight and brittle, and the grass underfoot made a sound like paper when stepped on. Mason strung thick canvas over the chicken coop and helped Winnie lay down straw inside the root cellar. They moved around each other without wasted breath, always knowing where the other would be one morning, after the girls had gone to the neighbors for a few hours to help sort apples. Mason found Winnie in the lean-to barn, sorting through a crate of nails and old hinges. "I've been thinking," she said without turning. He stepped inside and waited. "You could build on the west side," she said. "A room of your own, it wouldn't take much." His brows lifted. "You want me to move out of my own bed?" "No," she said, turning to him now. "I want to stop sleeping on the other side of a wall I don't need." He looked at her hands, then her face. "You sure?" "I don't do things I haven't turned over twice in my mind." "Then I'll stay where I am." She nodded, and they stood there in the scent of dry hay and cold wood, the light between them golden and clean through the slats. That night, over supper, Winnie braided Flora's hair while Mason read aloud from a worn almanac. Frankie leaned against his knee, half asleep, thumb hooked in her collar. Juniper lay curled under the table, twitching in his sleep. When the girls were tucked in and the coals banked low, Winnie lingered beside Mason at the hearth. He sat with one boot off, rubbing at the arch of his foot. She bent and took the other boot from him, working the laces loose with careful fingers. "I used to dream of being invisible," she said. He looked up. "Why?" "Because it was easier than being seen and dismissed. Easier than hearing what folks thought I was worth. You're not invisible now, I know." She met his eyes. "And I don't want to be." He reached up and touched a strand of her hair that had come loose from her braid. He didn't say anything more, and he didn't need to. Later, as the lantern light thinned and the wind picked up across the field, she followed him to the back room and closed the door behind her. The bed wasn't large, and they didn't talk as they settled under the quilt. She fit awkwardly at first, unsure where to put her long limbs, but Mason drew her in without hesitation, his hand on the curve of her hip, steady as always. She fell asleep with her ear to his chest and woke with sunlight on her cheek, his breath warm beside her. The next morning he rose early to check the traps along the creek. Winnie made coffee and biscuits, then sat outside on the porch steps, watching the frost melt into the soil. Juniper lay beside her, ears twitching at every sound. The girls came out still drowsy, blankets around their shoulders. "Is he ours for real?" Frankie asked, pressing close. "He is," Winnie said. "And so is this place, for as long as we want it." Later, when Mason returned with a pair of rabbits slung over his shoulder, she met him at the gate. He handed her the smaller one, and she took it without flinching. "I'll skin this one," she said. "You've done enough for one morning." He smiled, quiet and sure, and reached over to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't pull away. The wind in the fields was cold, but it didn't bite as hard anymore. Not with 4 voices in the yard and a dog at their heels. Not with a quilt shared between them and no walls left to hide behind. By late October, the air smelled of river silt and wood smoke. The last of the potatoes had been dug and boxed in the cellar, and the girls had taken to collecting dry leaves in a basket, chattering about pressing them between the pages of Mason's old farm ledger. The days were shorter, but not yet bitter. That hush before winter's bite. Winnie had begun mending clothes for nearby ranch families. Word had spread quiet and steady, buttons replaced with care, seams stitched smooth, no gossip, no complaints. She took the work in silence, the way she took most things, but Mason noticed the way her shoulders eased at the end of each day. It wasn't just survival anymore. She was building something. One afternoon, she stood at the chopping block behind the house, splitting kindling with a hand axe dulled from years of use. Her braid was tucked into her collar, and she wore one of Mason's old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Mason paused at the edge of the path, watching her for a moment before speaking. "I passed the Parker boy down by the creek. He says his mother's been asking who's keeping my shirt stitched so clean." Winnie didn't look up. "That woman's never liked me. She doesn't know you. She doesn't want to." Mason stepped closer, his boots crunching thin frost. "There's going to be a harvest dance in town. Week from Friday." The axe came down once more before she stopped. "You think I ought to go? I think you could if you wanted." She wiped her palms on her skirt. "I haven't danced since I was 17. No one asked after that. I'm asking now." She studied him, eyes steady. "You're not afraid of what folks will say." "I've been mistaken before," he said, "but not about you." She turned away, gathering the kindling into her arms. "I'll think on it." The night of the dance, Mason hitched the team early. The girls had been sent to stay with the widow Kellerman, who owed Mason a favor and had 2 grandsons near their age. Winnie stood on the porch in a dark green dress she had let out at the seams, the sleeves adjusted to fit her arms without tugging. Her hair was pinned up, not fancy but clean and neat, and her boots had been scrubbed nearly white at the toe. Mason's breath caught not because she looked different, but because she looked sure. As they rode into town, Winnie kept her hands tucked in her lap. "You ever take someone to one of these?" "Once, years ago." "What happened?" "She married a wheelwright in Cascade. I wasn't ready to settle." "Are you now?" He didn't answer right away. "I've been settled for months. Just didn't know it till you came along." At the Grange Hall, lanterns hung from the rafters and the floorboards echoed with footfalls. Fiddlers played in the far corner, and someone had brought pies and jugs of cider. Mason offered her his arm as they stepped inside. She hesitated, then took it lightly but without shame. No one stared, or if they did, she didn't allow herself to see it. Mason guided her through the first dance, slow and clumsy, but neither of them laughed. It wasn't about that. It was about moving together in rhythm on purpose. Afterward, they stood by the door with tin cups of cider. Winnie watched a young girl in a blue calico dress spin in circles by herself. "I used to do that," she said. Spin until I was dizzy. Thought maybe if I twirled fast enough, I'd wake up somewhere else." He looked at her. "And now," she turned toward him, eyes catching the light. "Now I wake up where I want to be." They didn't dance again. They didn't need to. They stood close, speaking soft about nothing in particular, then rode home beneath a moon that had risen fat and pale over the ridge. Back at the cabin, the fire had burned low. Mason poured water into the kettle while Winnie unpinned her hair, letting it fall long and thick down her back. She turned, not shy but deliberate, and laid a hand on his chest. "Tell me something you never say out loud," she said. He set the kettle aside. "When I was 12, I used to sleep in the loft of the barn just to get away from the sound of my father drinking." She didn't flinch. "Thank you." He reached for her hand. "Your turn." "I used to think no one would ever want to be beside me in the quiet. That I'd always be too much, too tall, too something." "You're not too anything, Winnie Mae Morton." She stepped closer, resting her forehead against his. "I know that now." In the morning, the girls tumbled through the door with twigs in their hair and stories about baby goats and berry jam. Flora clutched a ribbon she'd traded for a pine cone, and Frankie carried a bundle of feathers she planned to turn into something useful. Winnie set a skillet on the stove. "We'll be needing more eggs this week." "I'll check the nests," Mason said. Frankie looked up from her pile. "Did you go dancing?" "We did," Mason said. "Did you kiss her?" Flora gasped. "Frankie!" Winnie didn't answer. She just smiled, quiet, full, and without apology. Juniper barked once from the yard, and Mason stepped outside to see what he was after. The sun had risen clean and bright, and the air smelled like apple peel and ash. They didn't talk about what came next. They didn't have to. It was already here. The first snow came in early November, soft and slow, dusting the fence rails and piling along the eaves. The girls pressed their faces to the window in wonder, laughing at the way Juniper leapt through it like a deer. Winnie stood behind them with a folded quilt in her arms, her face quiet but full. Inside, the cabin held the scent of pine sap and warm iron. The stove clicked as it settled, and Mason sat at the table carving a new handle for the drawknife that had cracked 2 days earlier. He glanced up as Winnie moved past him, brushing her hand across his shoulder in passing. "I got a letter yesterday," she said. "From a cousin I haven't heard from in years." He set the blade down. "Where's she living?" "Near Aberdeen. Her husband runs a ferry across the Missouri. She says they've got a schoolhouse now and a woman there teaching who used to board with her. You thinking of writing back?" "I already did. Told her I've found work and a place and that the girls are well." Mason nodded, reaching for the file to smooth the edge of the handle. "You didn't mention me." "I said we're not alone here." That pulled his gaze up again. She didn't look away. Later that week, Mason took Flora to the creek to show her where the beavers had dammed up the flow. Winnie stayed back with Frankie, darning socks by the stove while the girl practiced writing letters in the ash pan with a stick. The cabin was warm, and the wind outside moved in slow, steady gusts. "Mama," Frankie said, squinting at her crooked S, "can we stay here after the snow melts?" Winnie set down her sewing. "Do you want to?" "I like it here. Juniper doesn't bark at the wind anymore." She brushed a hand through her daughter's hair. "Then we'll stay." That night, Mason brought in a box of early-cut spruce and stacked it near the hearth. The air between him and Winnie had settled into something unspoken but understood. They moved around each other like 2 pages turned by the same wind. "You ever think about marrying again?" she asked, her voice low as she folded towels by the window. "I've thought about you," he said, standing by the stove with his hands braced on either side of it. "I've thought about what it would mean to ask." She didn't answer right away. "I've never been asked, not properly." "Well, I ain't a man for getting down on one knee. My joints don't take kindly to theatrics." She turned, her face unreadable in the dim light. "Don't need theatrics." He stepped toward her. "The girls already have a home here." "I reckon you do too if you want it." "I do." He reached for her hand, rough palm closing around hers. "Then let's call it settled." The snow deepened over the coming days, blanketing the fields and weighing down the branches until they bowed. Mason built a sled from scrap wood and iron runners, and the girls spent hours gliding down the slope behind the barn, shrieking with joy. Winnie watched from the porch, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee. She wore one of Mason's coats now, and the sleeves were too short, but she didn't mind. One morning, just before Christmas, Mason rode into town alone and returned with a package wrapped in burlap and tied with twine. He handed it to Winnie without ceremony. "What's this?" "Something that belongs to you." Inside was a small wooden box carved with vines and wildflowers. She opened it slowly. Inside lay a simple silver band shaped by hand and polished to dull shine. "I traded for it from a man passing through. He'd been a silversmith once back east." She touched the ring gently, then looked up. "You keep surprising me." "I aim to keep doing that." They were married the next morning in the front room of the cabin, with the girls standing on either side and Juniper curled at their feet. The widow Kellerman came to witness, and brought a pie still warm from her hearth. There was no fanfare, just hands joined and promises spoken in voices that didn't tremble. That night, they sat together in the rocking chair by the fire, the girls already asleep in the next room. Mason held Winnie close, her head resting beneath his chin. "You ever think you'd have this?" he asked softly. "No," she said. "But now I can't imagine anything else." The light from the fire danced across the walls, and outside the wind moved through the trees like a lullaby. Spring came slow, but sure. The snow melted into the soil and green pushed up through the damp earth. The girls helped plant onions and beans, and Mason built a second coop behind the barn with Flora handing him nails and Frankie counting each board twice. Winnie took in more sewing, but only what she wanted. She kept a small garden near the porch for herbs and planted lilacs along the fence, saying little about why, only that they reminded her of something worth remembering. Mason built a bench under the cottonwood, and they took their coffee there most mornings, watching the sun rise over the field. They didn't speak much during those moments, but they didn't need to. The quiet between them had grown full instead of hollow. Each silence held by years of ache turned into peace. One evening in late June, they sat together on that bench, the girls chasing fireflies in the tall grass. Winnie leaned into Mason's side, her hand resting on his thigh. "You know," she murmured, "the wind doesn't sound lonely anymore." He kissed the top of her head, slow and certain. "That's 'cause it's not." The stars blinked to life above them, and the cabin behind glowed with the last light of day. Everything they had built slow, careful and true stood steady under that sky. And it would hold through every season to come.